Day and night, this man said long ago, day and night, mine enemies continually say unto me, where now is thy God? There are times in life and periods in history when the irreligious people seem to have all the best arguments, the most convincing facts seem to be mostly on their side. The reasons for not believing seem more distressingly evident than the assurances of faith. I say there are times like that when, despite the trusting hymns we sing in church, to all outward appearances, God seems nowhere round, or at best too remote, far away to make a difference. Long ago I heard a man say if skeptics were wise, they would come to the Bible for their arguments. There is no question raised today about the reality and relevance of God that is not somewhere reflected in the Bible. How often in its pages do you hear voices speaking in bewilderment, half in anger, half in anguish? Where art thou? Why hidest thou thy face? Why art thou silent? When the impious are swallowing up the good, you see it all through. This man who wrote the 42nd Psalm, we don't know who he was, and that doesn't matter at all. He is every man sometime when life gets snarled up and God gets far away. Around him were these pagan enemies, gleefully enjoying his predicament, prodding him, poking fun at him, day after day needling him with the question, where now is thy God? All right, where is he? Well, we're in a time when this old pagan taunt of the centuries has come home to us. Even in ordinary times, it's not easy to maintain a steady, constant awareness of God in our lives. Even the great saints will tell you that. We have enough personal experiences and disappointments within to ask the question from within. But when these personal frustrations become general, when they become social, when they are set in a generation where one towering frustration after another seems to overshadow the whole world, when you read the newspapers day after day and all the news is bad news, a public atmosphere is created, a climate, an atmosphere from which none of us can escape. It impinges on the personal life of each person. And while we may not today have irreligious enemies on the outside taunting us, we all have this question from within. Where is now thy God? It is not my purpose in this sermon to ask you to look on the bright side of things or to look for silver linings in the cloud. The business of the preacher today is not to comfort people and contribute to their slumber, particularly in an age that has pretty much ignored God and tried to live as though there were no God, but to point out to all people what is everlastingly true, that the whole earth, today as much as yesterday, the whole earth today is alive and alight with his presence and revealing. Some of you may have heard the story of the atheist teacher in the old days who in the classroom one day after his lecture on physics wrote on the blackboard, "God is nowhere." After recess, when the class was reassembled, there was another sentence under that, written with exactly the same letters, but arranged in slightly different fashion. God is now here. Well, perhaps the story never happened. It sounds a bit too pat. But what I'm saying today is that we all of us have that contradiction within ourselves. God is nowhere. God is now here. We are both believers and unbelievers, often not sure of him, and sometimes, like these people of Jesus' day, wishing for a sign. And it's the preacher's business today, in answer to that question, from within and from without, where now is thy God, not to provide a sign or to try to prove anything, but to simply keep saying to this jumpy generation what the prophets kept saying to theirs: God is now here. The whole world is alive and alight with his presence. To point out, first of all, that he is here now, and this is so obvious we miss it, that he is here now in the unfailing order of creation. Certainly nothing has happened in the chaotic affairs of men to dislodge that or even effect it. The steady, constant faithfulness of God. You look up at night, the stars still shine, undisturbed by Sputniks. Year after year, the earth brings forth, flowers bloom, grass grows, the sun shines on the evil and the good, the rain falls on the just and the unjust. Day after day, year after year, we live and move and have our being in an eternal steadiness, unchanged, undiminished by the feverish fretfulness of man. It's so constant, we take it all for granted. In fact, one of our difficulties in discerning God is just that, has always been centered in his constancy, or what we might call his humility. We look for him in the spectacular, the unusual, the miracle. And we miss him most because he is so near. We sometimes wish that he had a public relations department. If we were God, we'd certainly want to advertise it more. Put a sign on every tree: this tree comes to you through the courtesy of the Almighty. Now see here, I made this tree. Or put a signature on the sunset to let people know. I'm sure if we could thrust a star in the deep orbit of the sky, we would want our name listed on the committee that put it there. In fact, we make quite a to-do when we put a little gas ball a few thousand miles. We strain our necks to look up at this incredible manifestation of man's greatness. And it is something. It really is something from this little world to see. But the astronomers tell us that that's going on all the time out there in the great depth where we can't see. Old stars dying, new stars born, constant state, they call it. Mighty stars, the light of which we shall not see for 1,000,000 years. A little boy over in Cape Canaveral, about to say his prayers and troubled about all the missile shooting, said, "I hope they don't kill God." There's not much danger of that. The divine order isn't likely to be dislodged by our little firecrackers. The love of God is broader than the measure of man's mind, and the heart of the eternal is most wonderfully kind. And that's what we're surrounded with. Kindness, constant, unfailing kindness in creation. Morel Root wrote a little verse which he called the New Lunacy, in which he posed the contrast between the mightiness of God and the pettiness, the meanness of man when it comes to outer space. The new lunacy. The lords of power plot and plan to dominate the moon with man. If we can seize the moon, they say, the total earth must own our sway. A rocket there, a rocket here, can paralyze the hemisphere. The conquest of the moon shall be our symbol of supremacy. Yet, tides and strolling lovers find the moon still powerful and kind. Where is now thy God? Well, we remember he's still out there and still in here. Hidden from our eyes mostly not by his remoteness, but actually by his nearness. In the very constancy of creation, God is nearer to each one of us than we are to each other. Speak to him, for he heareth. Spirit with spirit shall meet. Closer is he than breathing, nearer than hands or feet. More than that, he is here now, silently, steadily sustaining the moral order. That inexorable law of the harvest that brings all nations and all men inevitably to judgment. You see, people, I was going to say like ourselves, perhaps I should back up and not say that, but people who hold a superficial concept of God are always in trouble with this. They think of God as an indulgent deity, and so they see him in the favored moment, but don't know where to find him in the frustration. In fair weather days, they recognize his presence, but in the frustrations, they complain about his absence. Where is he? You remember how Jesus accused the leaders of his day of moral blindness. There was nothing wrong with their eyes. They could see all right, but they were morally blind. They knew all about the weather. They could see the signs in the sky. They could trace the cause and effect relationship between a cloud and a thunder shower. They knew when it was going to storm. They knew by the signs in the sky. But they couldn't see the moral meaning of social movements. How certain behavior persisted in and unrepented of came inevitably to judgment. That they could not see. They could have learned it from the prophets, but they didn't. The working of a moral God in history. Well, we haven't learned it either. I think I will say what I started out to say. We too, we comfortable Christians, are too inclined to think of him as an indulgent father whose chief business is to take care of us. We see him in the favored time. In fair weather days, we recognize his presence. He is there. But when chaotic days come in our lives or in the world, when the storms of judgment blow in, we're almost certain to complain about his absence, even question his existence. Where is he? How can he let this happen? How can he be silent when the impious, that of course always means other people, are swallowing up the good, which of course means us? Well, perhaps it isn't surprising when you stop to think of how small we are and how short a distance we can see. Perhaps it isn't surprising in a time of universal turmoil like ours, when everything seems upset, that our little lives get shaken, that we begin to question the dependability of this faith that has been ours in moral law. We talk about the world going to pieces, falling apart, because to all outward appearances, the very foundations of civilization seem now in disintegration. But that is not what is happening. The world is not going to pieces. It's not falling apart. It's holding together with an amazing reliability. It's cause and effect, the law of the harvest, operating very well. What is going to pieces in the earth are the false ideas we've been trying to live by. Certain behavior coming into judgment. It is not the Christian faith today, but the rejection of it, the alternative to it, that's having a very hard time. Some older folks here will remember David Lloyd George, that scrappy little Welshman who became Prime Minister of England. Once on the floor of Parliament, he blundered into an amusing slip of the tongue. The opposition party was about to put through a bill which he vigorously opposed. And on the floor, in debate, he was describing the disaster which he felt would result. And in the heat of oratory, he got mixed a bit in his metaphor. Quite easy for a public speaker to do. He said, if your mad policy prevails, I tell you, the foundations underneath us will fall down upon us. Well, from the other side of the house, there was a titter of laughter. Someone arose, and to the great amusement of his colleagues, he asked, will the speaker please explain to the House what he means by the statement, the foundations under us will fall down upon us? And in one of the sharpest comebacks ever heard on that floor, which is famous for sharp repartee, the little Welshman wheeled and said, I mean, sir, that you are building castles in the air. So it's a misuse of language today to speak of the foundations being destroyed, because that's precisely what is not happening. What we are seeing is not the collapse of moral foundations or any weakening in moral law, but a terrific demonstration of their solidity. What we are seeing is the law of the harvest, which is operating very well. Chickens still come home to roost. Tyrants still defeat themselves. Overreach. Give them time, they dig their own inglorious graves. That's happening. Certain behavior persisted in, unrepented of, in even the righteous people, who perhaps aren't as righteous as they think. Certain behavior persisted in comes inevitably to judgment, so that even the big headlines in the newspaper over a period of years proclaim that this is God's world still, and it's not a good world to be bad in. Age after age. So said one of the great preachers of our time. Age after age, the law-abiding conditions of this universe wait, and the penalties of God's law broken fall with inexorable austerity on men and nations still. So the events of our time are not really obscuring God. They are revealing Him. And we need often to be reminded there is something at work in history quite beyond us, and that the destiny of the world is in stronger hands than ours. There's a cartoon some time ago of picturing the angel Gabriel up in heaven, about to blow his horn and stop the show. But the Almighty, leaning over, looking down on the world, said, "Hold it, Gabriel, they're going to have another summit conference. Give us a sign. Give us a sign." Where is he? He's nearer than we think. Here also, now, in the midst of the world's clashing forces, right down in the thick of the conflict, working toward His will and His purpose with patient persistence. During the First World War, so much of which was fought in muddy trenches, there's a story of two British soldiers who stood looking out over no man's land, that danger spot between the trenches. The younger of them spoke bitterly of the evil madness that was turning men into snarling animals. He looked at the tangled barbed wire and the bloodied mud holes, the broken bodies of men lying in them. And he said, "Captain, where is God?" Just then, two stretcher bearers climbed over the top and moved out under enemy fire to pick up a wounded soldier groaning there in his pain. And the captain said, "Look, son,
There he is. There goes God now. Well, certainly there come times to all of us when it's exceedingly difficult to see any sign of God's purpose. When the will of God seems to get lost in the sin and the cruelty and the confusion. But at no time, at no place are we without glimpses of something at work here. Something more than man, working through man to redeem him and overcome his follies and his sins. God is no spectator looking on. He's nearer than we think. He's in every patient striving today to bring light out of dark. He's in every deed of compassion, every small kindness you have shown, every small measure of forgiveness you managed last week. He's in all our social concerns. He's in every hospital where doctors and nurses minister to sick bodies. He's in every court of law. He's in every human service, however humble. He's in our United Fund organizations, where our cities across the nation hands reach out in helpfulness to other lives. Who prompts it? There he is. There goes God. He's in United Nations too. That table-thumping hullabaloo where faulty men, filled with ancient sins and prejudices, try to rise above them to bring order out of chaos and new hopes out of old hates. He's in the restlessness of nations too, that moves men in all over the world today to seek a higher light, a better life. He has great movements afoot today. God is working mightily in our midst, though sometimes obscured by the confusion. He's at work in the missionary heart all through the world. His compassion mediated through the hands of men and women with a dedicated heart. Even in the Congo, which of all places in the world today has seemed most God-forsaken. Out of the Congo, over the past few months, we've heard nothing but noise, tumult, anger, ignorance, anarchy. But behind the headlines, something is going on there that doesn't get into headlines. God. Let me read a few lines from a letter from Dr. Bill Hewlett, who is one of our medical missionaries in the Congo, and who incidentally will be in this church one night in the early months of next year. He was speaking of that awful moment when all hell broke loose. He said, as we came out of church, we were told by our radio operator that our consul in Salisbury was advising all non-essential Americans to leave the Congo at once. There was some joking among us as to who might be considered non-essential Americans. None of us wanted to go. Well, we had to go. And there was the heart-rending task of turning over the work and saying goodbye, for no one knew how long. The Africans could not begin to understand it. Since they had no enmity toward us, they stood around pathetically. While we waited for plane transportation, the nervous strain became acute. Some of our missionaries did not decide until the last moment whether to go or stay. What will happen to our patients, our students, and our faithful leaders? We can only leave them in the care of the Heavenly Father and feel the strength of Martin Luther's hymn, "A mighty fortress is our God." And he closes with this word: at the present time, things look very dark there, but we have the hope that in some way we will be able to go back to work with the people we love in the place where God has called us to serve. Well, you see, that's not spectacular at all. This sort of thing doesn't rate a place in the headlines with all the important fighting going on. But I can tell you, when my soul gets tired and sick of the sordid stories in the news, when I feel my faith in my fellow man needs a lift and I want to be sure of God again, I like to think of our missionaries and to shout against the noise. There he is. Don't you see? There goes God. Now, give us a sign. And there will be no sign. Nothing but the steady working of his Spirit. Can't you see that? Finally and briefly, we need to remember another thing. Where is he? He is here now in the hungers of men, in the restless yearnings growing increasingly acute. God hungers, born of a sense of futility and frustration and the utter emptiness of life without him. I don't need to tell you that this is the dominant mood of our age: anxiety, inner insecurity. Everyone is talking about that. One after another comes along and says our age is the age of anxiety. But what is anxiety? And what is it spelling out? The absence of God? No. On the contrary, it's the surest sign of his presence, the striving of his Spirit in our human hearts. Anxiety is the verdict out of life itself that man can never get away from God. The concern and the love of God, because God won't let him go. It's the verdict out of life itself that when you and I try to live without him or hide ourselves from him, nothing anywhere goes right. When life loses its center, it also loses its sense. It becomes meaningless. Even our joys and sorrows are pointless. And all life gets filled with this sense of futility and anxiety, and that's God's eternal hold on the heart of man. Not for long can we get away from God. We may decide we're all finished with it. all through with the Sunday school stuff. We may talk loudly about being modern people, emancipated from the old taboos and free. And then life moves us into the depths, and there he is, God, who will not let us get away. God, said Dr. Tillich, is present in the force that makes you restless. I don't need to tell you that that's the theme of the whole Bible. And it's a theme that I wish this year to be talking about a great deal. Not man seeking God, but God's relentless search for man. That's it. And nowhere is the ministry of Jesus more moving than right here. Wherever he talked to a person, a man or a woman, he assumed, he took it for granted that God had already been working in that person's life. It didn't matter whether the man was respectable or not. It didn't matter whether he was a churchman or not, whether he was accepted in the synagogue or not. He was a person whom God loved. And they got pretty quiet when he talked to them about the shepherd out looking for the sheep and the father waiting for a lost boy, a boy who had gone away. For this was the gospel. Not the sheep looking for the shepherd, but the shepherd looking for the sheep. Now I want to say this one word, and let you think about it, because it will take some thinking about. You may not believe it at first, but think about it. There is a sense in which God is never so near as when we're lonely, wretched, and when he seems far away. You think that over. Often the actual near presence of God is accompanied by a feeling of his remoteness. And in this whole question of finding God, it's not nearly so much a matter of our seeking him as letting him find us. Where is he? Not far away in here. As near as green grass to a hill, as petals to a daffodil, as near as sunlight to the sod, so near to the human heart is God. Let us stand, please. Eternal God, in whom we live and move and indeed have our very being, take thou the dimness of our soul away and enable us to receive thy salvation, thy saving grace. We do not invoke thy presence here, for thou art here. Help us to remember that there is nowhere where thou art not. Only open the eyes of our understanding, that we may become aware of thee, not as a far-off memory, but as the unseen friend on every common road, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.